Hello fellow Unreal Engine developers. Today I'm going to show you how to create this Glacier Valley landscape in Unreal Engine 5. My inspiration for today's tutorial was this Windows wallpaper of Hooker Valley in Mount Cook in New Zealand. I'll be covering everything from sculpting the terrain to painting the landscape textures and finally adding foliage and rocks. And I'm excited to say this will be the first of many landscape tutorials, each introducing new biomes and features over the coming weeks and months. Let's get started. The first thing we need to do is create and set up a new project. So fire up your Unreal Engine 5 editor and go into the Games section. And you might think you would start with a blank project, but I think it's better to start with a third-person project. That way you've got a reference character to judge the scale of your scene. And it's also useful to run around in your scene, even if you're not creating this for a game. If you're creating this for a cinematic or a production set, still useful to test it out. So I'm choosing third-person, target platform, desktop, maximum quality. I don't need starter content or ray tracing. And let's call it Glacier Valley and create. So it will fire up Unreal Engine with a blank, not a blank project, a third-person project with this test level. We don't want this test level, we want a blank level to create our landscape. Down here, if you get these messages, just dismiss new plugins, update, project file out of date. And we're going to create our new level. So file, new level, and we will start with an empty level and create. And before we do anything else, let's go up and save the level, save current level. You can leave it where it is. I'm just putting it at the top level in the content, and I'm going to call this Glacier Valley as well and save that. Now, if you want this level to load automatically when you start the editor or when you start your published project, you need to go into Edit, Project Settings, Maps and Modes, and just override the third-person map in these default maps with Glacier Valley for the editor startup map and for the game default map. That way you don't have to open up this level every time you come into the editor. Okay, so now we've got a blank project. First thing we need to create is lighting for the project. So go into the window menu, environment light mixer, and we want to create a skylight. So click that button. We want to create an atmospheric light 0, which is our sun. So click that. We want to create the sky atmosphere. I'm not going to create clouds in this landscape. I'm going to have a completely clear sky. And the last thing is create height fog. And if you come out of this dialog, you'll see you've got a sky, there's a sun up there, and the height fog creates this nice indistinct horizon as well, which is useful to have in the background. So that is the main setup. There are a couple of things we'll change over here. On the exponential height fog, go to the, so select the exponential height fog over here on the right. And in the fog density, let's change that to 0.001, which is creating a much clearer day with just a very slight fog in the background. We could change the fog height fall off as well. Let's see what happens if we make that 0.1. Yeah, okay, 0.1. Probably doesn't make too much of a difference, but just make sure you can see the horizon there. And the other important thing to change here as well is in the skylight, if you select skylight here, make sure you've got real-time capture on. Won't make any difference here, but if you forgot this and you put it on later on, you'll see that shadows are much more realistic with the light coming from the sky. So that is our basic setup for the level. We can now proceed to the first part of creating a landscape, which is sculpting the terrain. This is the inspiration for the landscape we're creating today. It's a Windows Spotlight wallpaper, and it came up on my computer, and I thought this would be a nice landscape to create. So I clicked to find out where it was, and you can see in the description above, It's in New Zealand. It's a glacier valley called Hooker Valley, and the mountain in the distance, the high mountain, is Mount Cook. So because this is based on a real place, we can get the terrain height data online, and we can apply that to our landscape rather than have to paint it in. But the first thing we need to do is decide what size landscape we're going to create. So if you go to this landscape technical guide for Unreal Engine, I've published the link in the description. It tells you all about the different sizes you can create and the height map resolutions you need. So if I scroll down a bit till I get to the recommended landscape sizes, and there are various sizes you can create. So I want to create a 2K by 2K landscape. Each vertex on a landscape is roughly equivalent to 1 meter apart. So I want to use this one here, third in the list. So it's 63 quads, 2 by 2 section, 16 by 16 components. I'll just remember that for when we create the landscape. And I'll have to have a height map that's a resolution of 2017 by 2017 to apply my height to the landscape. So you're probably asking yourself, where can you get the real world terrain? Well, there's this fabulous site I found called Tangram Heightmapper, completely free to use online. Again, I've put the description in the link below, or the link in the description below, I should say. So bring that up and you can see here's the world in height displacement terms. If you, on the right here, you've got these various parameters. Click on the map labels and start off with, it will tell you the country names. So we want to go into New Zealand. So just use your mouse wheel to zoom in. And so here's the North Island and South Island. It's in the South Island. You see this little island here? Just sort of head into this sort of section. Okay. And if you move along from this island, sort of in the same level, you want to find an area where there's a lot of different valleys going in. It's sort of here. Let's zoom in a bit more. Keep going in, and can you see Hooker Lake appears here? And this is the Hooker Valley that we want. So keep going in. And the white ridge here is the main mountain range. This sort of bit at the top here is Mount Cook. So keep going in, keep going in. Now we're going to render this, so I want to make this as large as possible on the screen for the best resolution. So in your browser, hit F11 just to make it as large as possible. And again, what I want to do is I want to zoom in. Let's come out slightly so that you get the ridge here at the top, the mountain ridge at the top, and the V of the valley at the bottom. And then we can render the resolution we want. Now the important thing here is this render multiplier gives you the scale that you want. So let's just put one in there to start off with, and I'll show you what I mean. If I hit the render button here, it's not the render name, is a text field. Underneath there is a button called render. If I click on that, it tells me that it's going to be 1920 by 1080 pixels, which is the resolution of my screen. But if you remember, we needed 2017 by 2017 for our terrain. So let's cancel this and let's change the render multiplier to 2. And now if I click on render, you can see that the resolution is going to be 3840 by 2160. So I can cut that down to 2017 square, 2017 by 2017. So that's perfect for what I want. So I'll click on OK, and it will cleverly move around on the screen and create the render, and it is now in my downloads folder. So let's go over to this folder, and here's the render here, and then we want to open this up in a Photoshop or something like that. Now I'm going to use GIMP because I'm using free software only in my tutorials, but it should be a very similar process with whatever graphic editing software you use. So GIMP you can just get online for free and download. So if you want to, go ahead, pause the video and get that before. And actually I've realized a mistake I've made here, which is that I have left the labels on. So actually we need to go back and just redo this. So let me just come back to here and switch off map labels. Right, so I've got just the height information now, and let's try rendering again. And it says render complete. Go to my folder, open it up with GIMP. So what we want to do now is we want to change the resolution of this to the required resolution for our size, which is 2017 by 2017. So to do that, if I go to image and canvas size, make sure this is unclicked so that we don't have it the same aspect ratio, and put in 2017 by 2017. And we can now drag the image to where we want it. So what we want to do is, if we want that mountain range, the white mountain range, to be at the top, and we want our valley, actually we want our valley to be sort of in the middle of the square. So something like, let's do something like that, so we get a little bit of the other valley as well, and the mountains. That'll probably do. It doesn't have to be exact, and you can always do it again. So click on resize, okay, and now we've got our square height map information. Now the only thing at the moment is that currently this is an 8-bit RGB color image, and the height map information for Unreal Engine 5 needs to be 16-bit grayscale. So we'll need to change that. So go into image mode and change that to grayscale. And then also go back to image precision and change it to 16-bit integer. And here, where it says how do you want to convert it, do linear light, so it won't change the white and black at all in terms of the light values. So nothing seems to have changed here, which is good. And we just need to now export this as an image we can use. So in GIMP you do Control-Shift-E and give it a name. Let's call it Glacier Heightmap. Make sure you have .png, and that's what I'm using for the format here, and click on Export. It should come up with some options here, so you should be able to leave those all as a default. The important thing though is we don't want to compress this at all. We want this to be as pure as possible, this image. So make the compression level 0 and click on Export. And now we have our height map. So we can go back to Unreal Engine. So this is where we left off from the first part where we set up the project. Just do a save, just so everything is ready to go. And we're ready to create our new landscape. So in the modes here, select mode, go to landscape mode. And the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we've got our landscape size set up correctly. So you want 63 by 63 quads, 2 by 2 sections, and 16 by 16 components. And now our overall resolution is 2017 by 2017, which is what we've created our height map for. So now we can go up to import from file on the new landscape. We will click on the 3 dots for the height map file, and we can now select our Glacier height map here and open that up. And notice that this also says height map resolution 2017 by 2017 here. So this matches up with the 2017 by 2017. And you can see on the screen here, we have a very low res view of the landscape. It's just showing the points at each the edge of each component. So you can see there's a mountain peak up here, so it's looking sort of accurate. So let's click on import, and we get a mountainous landscape, but you'll notice straight away there is this strange banding going on. Now you can move around the screen. If you hold your right mouse button down, you can use W, A, S and D to move around, and if you spin the mouse wheel as you're moving, you can speed up and slow down. But you can see straight away there's this very, very strange banding going on, and this is because we started off with 8-bit data and we converted to 16-bit data, and there's just detail that it wasn't able to fill in there, so it creates this sort of quantization noise or banding in the landscape. So how do we get rid of that? Well, first thing we'll do is we will delete the landscape so we can recreate again. So go to your landscape, press delete, so we can start from scratch again in a minute. Go back to GIMP, and what we can do is we can use the blur function in our graphics editor just to eliminate or minimize those banding effects. So go to your filters, blur, and we'll use a Gaussian blur, which is a sort of a general purpose blur, and I'm just going to set the X and Y size of the blur to 1.5. I found that this is sort of a nice value to have, so that we don't lose the detail of the mountains, but we do lose those bands or minimize the bands. So click on that. If you click on OK, nothing much will have happened here because the blur has been so subtle. And then if you go to File, and you can just repeat that export to Glacier Heightmap.png here. So re-export it. Okay, and now let's try it again. So let's go back to our Unreal Engine, go to the landscape. It's kept all the settings from before, so we've still got the height-map file, we've still got the settings here. The other thing we can change here is maybe the scale of this in Unreal Engine is too high for you. I think the height of Mount Cook was a bit high because we have to convert the range of the height map into the range in the landscape we want. So if you want to change that scale, you can change the Z value of the scale here. So 100 is 100%. Let's make it 75. So it's 75% of the height map value, and click on import. And this looks good. So I can hardly see, you can see the bands there slightly in the valley, but it's very subtle and smooth. And by the time we've added all of our other landscape features on there, you won't notice that. And you can see our mountain range looks pretty good. In fact, if I go into play mode here with my character and run around, you can see that it's definitely a valley. And if I look over at the mountain range, it looks a fairly good size. So we have our sculpted landscape now based on the real world data. Let's move on to painting the landscape textures. Our next stage is to add textures to our landscape. So we want snow on the mountain peaks, sort of rock faces and rock on the slopes, and grass at the ground level. And you can paint everything manually, but for large landscape you typically want to use something called an auto landscape material, and this is a parameter driven material that will paint textures based on height, slope and other parameters. So creating an auto landscape material is a whole series of tutorials in its own right, and there are plenty of YouTube playlists out there that show you how to do that if you do want to do that. But as this is a beginner based tutorial, I'm going to use an existing auto landscape material that's free for non-commercial use. that's called OpenLand. So again, I have provided the description to the GitHub repository where you can download it. So go over to that repository, click on the code button here and download the zip file and unzip it somewhere. Once you've done that, go to the unzip folder and open it up. You will probably have OpenLand and some other folders at the top level. So go into OpenLand. Your second folder will be content, so open that up, and then in the third folder there'll be OpenLand and maybe some other folders such as third person. So it's this third folder that you want to copy. If you just want to check, if you double click on that folder, it should look like this: Blueprints, Core, Grass. So it's the folder that contains this that you want. So go back up a level for OpenLand and then just copy it with Control-C. Go to your Unreal project. So this one we call Glacier Valley. Go into it, go into the content folder and then paste it there. So it should copy all that. So now you should have in the content folder, you've got your Glacier Valley map, third person folder, some other content as well, and now you've got OpenLand. So if you now go back to your project and you go into the content drawer, you should see at the top level in content, you've now got a new OpenLand directory with all of these subfolders in place. So just make sure that that is the case. And now what we can do is we can apply this auto landscape material to our landscape. So select the landscape in the outliner on the right. In the details panel below, just scroll down until you see landscape material. And at the moment it's set to none. So we've got this checkerboard pattern. Take the drop down, type the word theme, and we're going to use the default OpenLand theme here, which should actually do a lot of the work for us. So click on that and you'll see this horrendous looking reflection of the sky in the landscape at the moment. And that's simply because we haven't created the main auto landscape layer in our landscape section. So go to your select mode and choose landscape. Make sure you choose paint in the top menu, and you see now we have all of these layers. This is part of this material. It allows you to automatically create the landscape textures, but it also allows you to paint sand and puddles and mud. So we'll use a little bit of this later on, but for now all you want to do is this auto forest, which is the main automatic landscaping part of the material. We just want to use this drop down and assign it to this auto forest layer info, so it's got somewhere to store the information. So if you click on that, and you should straight away see a landscape with a little bit of snow on the peaks, rocks on the mountainsides and grass on the ground. If you don't see this, you might need to right click and do fill layer here, but I think this should work for you automatically. So we now have a good starting point for setting the parameters. Obviously we want more snow here and we want a valley going through there, but we have a good starting point. So let's come out of the landscape mode, just go back to select here. Now will be a good time to do a quick save, and what we'll do is we'll bring up the material here so that we can start playing with the parameters. So with your landscape selected, landscape material, go and browse to that in the content browser and open it up. And you'll see it has lots of parameters. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in a window on the right hand side. So just move your windows around and adjust them so that you can still read everything in this panel here, and we can see enough of our landscape over here. So I might make this a little bit larger as well. You can do F11 while you've got the landscape selected in order to pick it, and we can move around. Actually, something else that might be useful now as well is might be useful to pick a sort of a viewpoint that you can come back to regularly. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm using W, A, S and D on the keyboard. You can also use Q and E, E to go up and Q to go down. So what I want to do is I want to find a sort of a point on the landscape where I can see a lot of the mountain range, maybe a little bit of the mountains on this side. And then what I'll do is I'll hit Control and 1 on the keyboard, and what that does is it stores a view which I can jump to just by pressing 1 on the keyboard. So if I move around somewhere and I press 1, it snaps back to that view. So you can see I could move around up here, see the whole landscape, and then if I just hit 1 on the keyboard, it takes me back to that view. And the other thing you might want to do here as well is you might want to change the field of view. So in this drop down here, you've got a field of view here. At the moment it's 90 degrees. If I make it say 110, you can see it creates a sort of a wider viewpoint here. So I might want it more like this, so I can see more of the valley floor down here. So in fact what I'll do is I'll reset that viewpoint with Control 1 again. Okay, so now this is now my sort of standard view, even if I move around. All right, so let's now start playing around with the landscape material. And actually I'll just change the lighting first. What I want to do is I want to have more shadow. You can see the shadows coming from, well, the sun is behind me at the moment. So if I click on my landscape and if I use right control and L for light, but don't release the control key. So right control L and then keep the control key down. And now you can move your mouse around and you can change where the sun is in the sky. So you can go up and down, left and right. So can you see, if you can get the sun down to sort of here, just between those mountains, and then move to the right and maybe up slightly, just so there's a little bit of, so a little bit of sunlight coming over the mountains and putting them in shadow, something like that. We can play around with it later, but just gives us a bit more contrast to play with. So the first material I want to look at is, well, actually the first thing I want to look at is the general blend of the sort of rock and the grass. There were 3 textures actually between the grass and the snow. There's this grass texture, there's this mid texture, which you only see a little bit of at the moment. It's sort of a gravelly texture. There's the rock texture, and then there's the snow. And the way that it decides how to blend those is to do with this slope here. So if you click on these first 2 auto blend parameters, you can see if I make the auto blend slope 0, it's all grass. If I make it minus 14, everything is rock. So actually what it was set to of minus 7 was actually pretty good, because it is similar to what I'm going for, which is there's grass in the sort of valley floor and a little bit of grass on the slope, but then it becomes rock. The next thing I want to look at is this mid-range, because it seems to go directly from grass to rock without much of this sort of mid material in between. So the next parameter here, mid-range, if we change that to say 1, can you see it adds more of that mid-range here? Let's go for 2. Yeah. So again, what we're doing is we're pushing the rock more into just the slopey areas in the higher areas, and having this sort of gravelly area here. And actually that value of 2 looks pretty good to me. So, there's areas here where there's no rock, and then once you get to the cliff face, it goes up here. So that's actually pretty good. So I'm happy with the blend between the grass, the mid and the slope. but I want to bring that snow much further down, almost, you know, to the bottom of the mountain and before the valley floor. And the snow, the amount of snow is determined by a smart mask in this material. So there's a lot of parameters here, but if you scroll down to a section, I'll tell you what the number is when I get there. Right, section 8.1, Smart Mask 1, and this is a dedicated mask for the snow. So I'm going to turn off a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to turn off this edge noise, and I'm going to turn off the area noise here as well. We'll reintroduce those in a moment, but now we're just dealing solely with a mask for where the snow appears or disappears. And the first important thing here is the threshold. So the threshold determines at what height the snow starts to appear. So if I make it 0, you can see the snow comes down. If I make it minus 5,000, it's coming down even more. And the direction here is either 1 or -1. If it's 1, we're masking everything above this point. If it's -1, we're masking everything below it. So if I made it -1, you can see the snow is below us. And if we were doing an Antarctic or Arctic landscape, this would be the way we'd want to go. But we're doing snow on the peak, so make that 1 again, and then let's keep reducing this. Okay, so we're keeping to reduce this. The other factor here is this edge smoothness. If I make this, it's 25,000. If I make this 0, we get this very hard line. So we will want to introduce some smoothness in a moment. But let's get the rough height of the snow. So let's go down to minus 20,000. A bit too much. Minus 15,000. Okay, that looks about right to me. So let's make that edge smoothness 15,000. Okay, and now what we'll do is we'll reintroduce this edge noise, and what that does is it makes it so that it's not a sort of a complete line between the snow and the texture underneath. It's going to create these sort of noise elements that curl around at the bottom of the edge. So if I click that on, after a second, once it's recompiled the shaders, we get this much more realistic spotty texture, which is to my eye anyway, looks much more like the way you'd see snow, little patches appearing. So again, you can play around with these parameters, but I actually quite like that, and I think the height looks about right here. You can see in that far mountain the snow almost comes down as slightly in the top of the valley. Okay, so the only other thing I want to do on the snow in this mask is I want to, at the moment it's all the way from the top down to the edge, but I want to do it so that it's not in all the sections at the top of the mountain, and I'm going to do that based on slope. So if you go to these, put on these slope start and slope end parameters, at the moment it's anything between 0 and 1, so it's covering all bases. But if I make the slope start 0.5, you can see now the snow is only on the more level areas. So it's, again, this is great for sort of realism, because snow, if it fell, would obviously fall down from the steep areas. But actually I want more snow than that. So what I'll do is I'll try go down to 0.2. Again, it's what suits your sort of aesthetic viewpoint, but I'm probably going to go for, let's do 0.25, yeah, something like that. And yeah, I quite like that. So we've got the amount of snow we want. So I've almost finished with snow. The only thing I want to look at now is the tiling of the texture. So what we need to do is we're finished with our mask here. go back up to the section 3.4, which is our top texture. So this is where we have, let me move it along a bit so you can see. This is where we have our textures. So the top texture has got the snow, base color, normal and roughness, and it's also got all of the other parameters for how we want the snow texture to appear. And you've got here the tiling. So top, these three here. So enable distance blending means that it will have different tiling between the snow that's near you or near the camera and snow that's further away. So all of the snow we're seeing at the moment is far away. So we can change this far tiling parameter. And if I make it, it's 20 at the moment. If I make it 200, it's quite subtle, but you see that the snow got a bit grainier. I mean, let's make it 500. Yeah, it's quite far away, so it's quite a subtle thing, but to my eye anyway, it looks slightly bumpier now, and probably a little bit more realistic. There's a bit more texture in there now, rather than it's less smooth. But we also need to check our near tiling as well. So if we zoom in over there and get close to the snow, in fact, let's go where there's a bit more snow up here. And now if we change the near tiling to something like 10, 50, you can see when I go to 50, it's kind of got this sort of icy quality to it, because it's packed the textures more densely together. 20, it's slightly more, yeah, slightly, you can see it's got sort of a little bit more of a sort of a puckered effect. So again, you can play with those to suit your requirement. I'm going to go back to my view here by pressing 1, but that looks pretty good to me. So I think I can then move down to playing with the next layer. So snow, let's say the snow's done. Let's move down to our slope layer. So go from section 3.4 here to section 3.3. And again, all I really want to do here is look at the tiling and maybe the color of it. Or maybe I want to make it a slightly sort of grayer to match the granite of the real Hooker Valley. So let's look at the tint first. So click on here for tint, and really all I want to do is make this lighter. It's sort of grey, but it's just dark grey. So this value here, if I make this sort of 3, can you see it's just made this texture here a lighter grey, and that's probably all I want to do in the color side of things. But I want to change the tiling, so let's look at our tiling. So again, we've got distance blending enabled, so we've got different tile between near and far. This is all far tiling at the moment, so let's have a look at making that 200. Again, it's all down to what you prefer. 300, actually I quite like 300. It seems to create a little bit more interest in this area here. The other thing you can play around with as well here, and this is why I think this particular auto landscape is so useful, is it has the ability to do rotation and scaling of textures as well. So if you click on these 3 parameters further down, use random rotation scale and then random rotation and scale influence, what you can do, let's put this to 1. What it does is it rotates around the textures to give you some variety. That's probably too much, but something like 0.2 it will just rotate some of the textures around so they're not the same all the time. In particular with near tiling, when you're standing on something, you can often see the regularity of tiling. So this is really useful. Let's do the same with the scale as well. Yeah, again, you can't see, it's changed slightly here, but again, let's get close up somewhere. Let's move up here. Yeah, you can see it here. So I know it's blended with the snow a bit here, but this will be near tiling. If I go to the near tiling here and change it to 10, 30, again, you just play around with it until it looks how you want it. And we've got some rotation going on here, so it's rotation and scaling here, so that it's not, you can't see a regular pattern in here when you're close up. So I think we'll say that the slope section is done now. Let's snap back to our main view. Now let's work on our mid section, because I think this is now a bit dark and we want to blend that in with the sloped landscape here. So let's go move up to section 3.2 of our landscape material, the mid texture and parameters. And again, let's just start off with mid tint and go on here and make it, so at the moment it sets a value of 0.7. Let's make that 2. And again, that's lightened it up. It's quite light on this side, but again, that's probably because I've got the sun facing onto it. But yeah, I quite like that. It's and again, we could play around with the tiling here. So we've got our blending on. So the far tiling, let's make that 50. Yeah, and can you see now, you can see a little bit more of the rocks in that texture. And the near tiling down here actually looks pretty good. You can see what looks like sort of little pebbly ground underneath our feet. So yeah, I think we'll leave those values as they are. And the grass is just very light at the moment. I know we're going to be adding real foliage on this later on in this tutorial, but I still would like to have the texture to be darker as well. So let's go up to section 3.1, which is ground, where we're having all our grass textures. And in the tint here, the value is quite low at the moment, 0.14. Let's make it 0.07. And can you see that has brought down that grass value? And it's already got some good settings in here. Can you see how there is some variation in the color here? It's this ground variation tint intensity, and so it's not all one color here. It's got sort of patches of darker grass there. So this is pretty good. And I would say that for the auto landscape, we're pretty much done here. So before we move on to adding some manual texturing, I just want to change the exposure, because it's very it's a bit light, this scene at the moment. So what we will do is we will I'm going to hit F11 here just to come back to our main view. And what I will do is add in a post-process volume. This is where you can change things like exposure and other camera effects. So go into the input, the quickly add to the project, volumes, post-process volume, and just drag it into the scene. With it selected in your outline, which it should be by default, go to the details section and search for infinite extent. And make sure that's checked. What that does is that makes sure that the post-process settings are applied across the whole landscape. And now hit X on this box to remove that search. Now we can go down to exposure. So still in the details for the post-process volume, I want you to select these first two parameters, make the metering mode manual, everything will go dark, and then the exposure control 10. Maybe 11. Okay, and you can see now that we've got a lot more contrast in our scene. We can see the sort of shadows are a little bit darker, and our landscape and everything really is just a little bit darker. So I think we can say that this section of the landscape is finished. And what we'll do now is we'll move on to some manual texturing for the valley floor and a path leading to the valley floor. Now I want to manually texture a couple of areas of my landscape. I want the valley floor to resemble a dried out riverbed with a few puddles remaining, and I also want a little sand path to come down from the grassy plain down into the valley floor for our walkers. So I'm going to do these textures manually. You need to go into the landscape mode and select the layer that you want to paint. So if I scroll down, so make sure in paint section of the landscape, you've got all of these layers here. Pull this scroll down, keep pulling it down. Even when you get to what you think is the bottom, just keep pulling it down until you find this puddles area. And in the drop down here, yours will probably be set to none at the moment. Select the puddles layer info so there's a layer info in which to paint the texture information. And then scroll back up to the top of the this dialog. Make sure the brush type, this should be by default simple circular brush with a smooth fall off, tool strength of 0.3, brush size 2048, and I've made the brush fall off, yours will probably be 0.5. I've brought it all the way up to 1, so it's got a feathered edge, so it'll blend nicely at the edges into the other landscape. So again, just make sure, come down here, scroll all the way down, make sure you've got the puddles layer selected, and now let's move around our landscape. Hold the right mouse button down, use WASD, E and Q to go up and down, and what I want to do is I want to paint all the way down this valley floor. So let's just start sort of here just to show you. Left mouse button, as you start to paint, first of all you'll get this checkered thing for a second, just release, and then it should start to paint. And can you see that I'm getting this sort of puddly ground texture here? So I can make the brush a bit bigger if I use the square bracket. So if the square bracket up, this is a bit like Photoshop, goes up in size, square bracket, left square bracket goes down in size. So let's make it a little bit bigger. It's a bit like this. And I'm going to paint it all the way up into the start here. And I'm going to sort of go up to the edge. So we're following this valley floor. And if you make a mistake anywhere, you want to delete something, you can hold the shift key down and then paint over and it will remove. So you can see there I've sort of removed it. So don't worry if you make a mistake, you can just paint over it again. So let's go back and up a bit. And I'm really just painting sort of down this valley floor. So leaving a little bit of an edge for our grass. And then let's go back again, down, back a bit. Obviously I'd want to paint this whole valley floor, but for the sake of this tutorial I'll just go down to the edge of the screen here. Okay, that'll do for now. So let's come back out of landscape mode. Let's switch to our standard view. So this is looking good. So you can see now we've got this valley floor that comes down here and it's got some puddles here. So let's play around with the texture for this puddles layer until we get it to the way we want it. If you're not seeing reflections here, you can change your light. Remember, with the right Control L, you'll only see the puddles when the light is or the sun is in such a position that it reflects off them. So in order to see our puddles layer, we need to bring up our material instance again. You may still have it on the screen. I deleted it since the last part of the video. So go to your landscape, go down to your materials, find the landscape material and open it up again, this OpenLand theme default. And the section you're looking for now in here is the puddles layer, which I will tell you the number, section 3.5. And this has got a lot of the same features that you saw in the last part of the tutorial, the tiling section, but it's also got this puddle size here as well and puddle contrast. So this affects where water appears. So if I make the puddle size smaller, like 50, you get sort of smaller puddles spread around, or sort of wider areas of puddles. Quite like that size, the default size of 200. And the contrast affects how smooth it is between the puddle and the surrounding landscape. So you can see that something like 5 has more puddles. Again, I quite like that, so I'll probably go with that. The only thing I might change here, although it does look quite good, I might just make it slightly darker here as well. So that's the tint here. So with the puddles tint selected, click on that and we'll change our value. So at the moment it's a value of 0.1. If I do, so it's 1. If I do 0.5, it makes it darker. And yeah, you know what, I quite like that. I quite like it to be darker because again it looks as though it's slightly wetter as well with that darker colour. So I will say OK there, save our material, and I'll close that down because I don't really need that open anymore. And that's looking good. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to do another, let's move around a bit. I'm going to change my standard view to be here so I can see just some grass in the foreground, the valley floor and the mountains there. So remember, Control 1 to set my first camera view, and then I can always come back to that. So what I want to do now is I want to create a little sand path that goes down from this grass into the valley floor. So to do that, I'm going to go back to, let's do a quick save. Don't worry if you sometimes see this sort of jagged view, it's only while it's sort of saving and reloading the material. And again, sometimes you see these triangles, as soon as you move around they'll be fine as well. So again, don't worry about those. Let's go into our landscape mode again and go down to our sand layer. Make sure you assign the sand to the sand layer info so we've got somewhere to paint on. Our brush is a bit big at the moment, so make the brush size, maybe even that's too big, make the brush size 500. Change the brush fall off so it's a little bit harsher, and you might want to just use E, right click, sorry, right, oh, I didn't mean to do that. I just painted a little bit of sand over there, but I'll just do Control Z. Right click and use the E key just to come up slightly. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the texture going down here. Again, I think maybe even this is slightly too big. Let's do 250. Yeah, that probably looks about right. Again, we won't know until we've got the player in there. So what I'm going to do is just from where this grass joins the texture, I'm going to just do a little wiggledy line coming up here. Don't worry about that pixelation you're seeing because this is all going to be covered by grass a bit later on. So let's come back out of here again. Maybe make the brush fall off 1 so it's more feathered. And again, let's just carry that path on down here. And then you can just sort of go back over it a bit. Fine. So that's our walker's path down to the valley floor. Okay, and let's go back to our select mode. That's our viewpoint here. So we've got the path just on the left here. You could play around with the sand texture as well. I should have probably left the material instance up. In fact, let's just quickly do that. So we've got the textures. We've all got our textures the same. So choose the landscape, go down to our landscape material, browse to it, open up the OpenLand theme default. And this time we're going to go down to the sand section, which is section 3.6, and again it's all about sort of tiling and tinting. It's a bit light here at the moment, so in our sand tint let's make the value 0.15 just to make it that looks a bit better, a bit darker. Actually, I quite like the tiling. You can see it looks like sort of footprints in the sand, And you could also do things like, it's got variation tints here as well, so it can have variations in the colouring. We see it in the grass here where it have darker patches, so maybe we want some sort of browny reddier bits here. Let's make them a bit darker. Oh, I haven't got intensity, so this isn't going to apply until you apply some sand variation tint intensity. So if I make that 1, yeah, you can see you've got little splatterings of sort of reddy brown in there. Actually, I quite like that. Maybe slightly less, 0.7. Yeah. So now we have our path leading down to valley floor. Let's just go into play mode, see what we've got. So there's our character, here's a path, sort of wide enough for 2 or 3 people to go down, and we can go down to the valley floor, and we've got water here. Again, got quite a lot of water here, but it's down to what you prefer. Might reduce the water later on so that it's a bit more dried out. And then we've got our other rocky faces. So we're pretty much done with texturing now. So the next thing we want to do is add some grass. So let's do that. Now we're going to add some grass to our scene, and there are 3 ways of adding foliage to a landscape. You can manually add it. If you go into the foliage mode up here, you can paint the grass onto the landscape just like we did our textures. The second way you can do it is use something called a procedural foliage volume. So you can set areas of the landscape where you want to spawn foliage and trees, and in fact we'll use that a bit later on to spawn our rocks in clusters around the landscape. And the third method is called a landscape grass type, and this is where you associate the grass spawning with different layers of your landscape, and that makes the most sense in this particular example because we want to spawn the grass wherever we have the grass texture on the landscape. Now fortunately our material that we've been using, our OpenLand auto material, also has landscape grass types set up automatically, so all we need to do is define where we want what types of grasses we want and what density we want. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get some grasses to put on our landscape. So you need to open up, if you go to the Unreal Engine Marketplace, under Window, Open Marketplace. So once we're in the marketplace here, there's a wealth of assets here, and particularly there's a wealth of free assets available. So if you search in the products for temperate, and you want temperate vegetation, and the one you want is this one here, temperate vegetation foliage from Project Nature, temperate vegetation foliage collection, and you'll have to probably download it first if you haven't done so. So do that, and then once you've downloaded it, then just click Add to Project and select the project that you want to add it to. So our project's called Glacier Valley. Add to Project, and it just transfers all of those meshes and materials into the project you have open. Okay, let's close that down. And if we now look in our content section, you can see that we now have a foliage collection here that we can use. So you've got various meshes of grasses here that we can use. So we're going to, obviously we've got lots and lots here, we don't need all of these, but we'll put 3 different types of grass on the landscape, and again you can have fun playing with this to get the look that you want. Now before we actually put any grass on there, there's a very important performance point for Unreal Engine 5. I did a video a few weeks ago on foliage hints and tips, which you can see in the card above. but there was a big performance hit if you had virtual shadow maps on. I'm hoping that it's something that will be fixed in time, because the virtual shadow maps are do look better. I will try and show you that later on without bringing my PC to a halt. So go into your edit project settings, search for shadow, and you see at the moment we've got virtual shadow map set up. So just select that and just go to shadow maps and go back. So you won't see much difference at the moment. You might get some warnings if you build a landscape. If you've got any nanite meshes on here, it might say non-nanite meshes don't look as good, but it will. They're just warnings. And as I said, you may find in the future that this problem goes away. All right, let's do a save. As always, don't worry about the pixelation. That'll sort itself out. So how do we apply our grasses to the grass texture? Well, go into your content drawer, go to your OpenLand directory, and there's got a subdirectory here called grass, and each of these assets here is a grass type, a landscape grass type associated with that layer. So you've got a grass type associated with the slope, the mid of your landscape, the ground, and the smart masks. So we want it on the ground layer. So double click to open this up. And at the moment we have no grass varieties associated with this layer. So click on this to add an element. And we want, what you're setting here is various settings for how dense you want the grass, the culling distance, other things like that. So I'll show you the key features as we go through. For our first grass, we'll set the density to 600 per, this is every 10 square meters. So it's going to spawn 600 grasses in a 10 square meter radius. And the grass will select, if you click on this mesh, type grass, and we want grass 0103. And you'll get a very light grass appearing here. In terms of using the grid, we'll say no, we don't want to use a grid, we want it to be random. And culling distance will go from 0 to 20,000 units. So we can see it on the distant landscapes as well. Okay. And we'll also, at the moment, it's all the same size. So we'll have some variation in size from 0.5 to 2 units. So various different scales. And actually, let's just go down a bit on the landscape so we can see. Okay, so we have some very light grass here at the moment. We want to darken that up in a moment, but at the moment we're just sort of spreading it out. So so other things we want to do here at the moment, it's aligned to the surface, which as it's fairly flat anyway, it doesn't make much difference. But in reality, grass pretty much always grows up even if it's on a slight slope. So if you uncheck that, the grass will always grow up even if it's on a slope. So that's more realistic. So that looks pretty good. Only thing is that it's very light at the moment. We want to darken that grass. Maybe we'll do that later on. Let's do the other grasses first. Okay, so let's add another grass type. Let's go up a bit, round a bit. I'm going to actually set this as my new camera view with the path here lower down. So Control 1 to set that for my camera view I can come back to. Let's now duplicate this. So go to the top index here, do duplicate. Let's close that down, go into the index 1, and we'll change the mesh to grass 0104. So we've got a bit of variety there. I'll leave the density the same. I'll change the cull distance to 10,000. So it doesn't appear as much in the distance. As long as I got some grass in the distance, it doesn't matter. But I'm going to reduce the burden on the graphics card by having the end cull distance a bit closer. same scale. And actually, if you want to look at performance, if I do Control Shift H, I'm getting around about 82. Let's just move this over slightly. Yeah, I'm getting around about 82 FPS at the moment. I'm on an RTX 3080 here though, so you might find that you've got a lower frame rate depending on your graphics card. If I had the virtual shadow maps on, this would go down to about 5 to 10, and it's just unplayable, unusable at the moment. So that's our second grass. Let's add a third one in here with a slightly different variety. So let's go into here, duplicate, go into our index 2, and this time I'm going to reduce the density to 100, and I'm going to choose grass 0603, which is a sort of a feathery grass here that you're seeing in the foreground here. In terms of scale, yep, I'll leave it as 0.5 to 2 here, and the end cull distance I'll make 2000, so it only appears in the foreground. So let's go into play mode, and you can see I've got my various grasses around. We probably need to change some of the lighting and maybe even the material on the grass, because as I said, it's very light at the moment. So let's do that. Let's change lighting first and see what effect that has. So let's come out here, go back to my camera view. Let's move this up here for a second. So go into our post-process volume first of all. Go to the exposure compensation here. Let's make that 10. So that's reduced the light here a bit. So that's quite nice. Quite like that contrast. But I need to change the material on the grass to be darker. So let's go back to, let's pull these back out, the grass meshes. Let's start off with the first one here. Go to the mesh, open up the material. So that's our material here. Go to the material, open it up, and you can see it's got a tint here for the material, so we can select that, and let's make the value 0.5, and can you see that immediately that grass reduces in value? I wonder if I can even go lower. Yeah, 0.3. Yeah, that to me is much more fitting to the landscape. So we need to do the same for the other two grasses as well. A bit tedious, I know, but let's come out here, save, don't forget to save. Come out here, come out of the mesh, go to the second grass here, browse to it, open it up, browse to the material, open it up, go to the tint, double click, select it, double click, make it 0.3 to darken it. Okay, save, close, close, and our last mesh here, same thing, browse to the mesh, open it, browse to the material, open it, select the tint, change the value to 0.3. Yeah, and now we don't have this luminous grass anymore, so don't forget to save. And let's save that landscape grass type as well. And I think we're done with the grass type here, so you can see when we look around we now have grass. Obviously we need to extend our riverbed down here, but we have you can see the frames per second. When I look down here where there's now grass everywhere, it's gone down to 32 because I've got the culling distance right in the background. So if I change the culling distance to 10,000, that would improve drastically. So just be aware of that from a performance point of view. If you're doing this for sort of production set, cinematic, then you're probably going to have a view in mind, and you can go ahead and put as much grass as you want in for a fixed scene. But that looks good from the perspective of the sort of player as well. It's about the right sort of height grass. I'm going to try and show you. What I'll do is I'll pause the video and then I'll restart it and try and show you it with virtual shadow maps, so you can see the difference in quality, and hopefully you'll be able to see it. And as I said, for it is better quality, but so definitely for sort of film use, cinematic use, I would definitely switch that on. But for game use, you can't at the moment. So as I said, I'll pause the video and then come back in a second. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you what it looks like with virtual shadow maps enabled. So I've left the frame rate up here so you can see I'm getting a frame rate of about 80 facing this direction. It was 40 facing back down the valley. So if I go back to, let me do a save here, go into Edit Project Settings, choose Shadow. Okay, you can see the grass in the foreground here. This is where you'll really notice the difference. So if I select virtual shadow maps, don't know if you notice straight away, well, first of all, our frame rate has dropped drastically down to 22, but the grass in particular looks much more realistic. The shadow in between the leaves and the shadow between even these little sort of feathery fronds here. So as I said, it's a real shame that the performance is so bad. If I go into play mode now, even just moving around in the editor window, it's very sort of stuttery. And if I go into play mode, it's really not very good. I daren't even turn around to face down the valley because it'll probably go down to 1 or 2 frames per second, and the recording won't work. So you can see that virtual shadow maps do look great, but they're just not performant at the moment. So let's finish off our tutorial by adding some rocks and stones, and then we'll have a finished landscape. We're on the final stretch now, just creating some rocks and stones scattered around the landscape. First thing I'm going to do, before we obviously need to get some stones and rocks, looking at this, the field of view I've realized actually flattens the landscape a bit. So I'm actually going to go back to my field of view to put it back to 90. It just creates an illusion of a bit more height in the mountain range. So I'm going with that. Again, it's just what I want. If you don't want it that way, you stick with the field of view you want. So firstly, we need to get some stones to scatter around our landscape, and I'm going to get those from Quixel Bridge. So if you go to the Add to the Project menu, choose Quixel Bridge, and if you do a search here, I'll show you the stones that I'm using, and then you can search for those. So I'm going to use these scattered granite rocks and this tundra small stone. So these are the two I want you to search for: scattered granite rocks, tundra small stone. In the quality setting, you'll have to download those when you find them. In the quality setting, choose medium. There's only low and medium available. And once you've downloaded them, select both of those and add them to your project. And once you've done that, you can close down Bridge. And just to double check, go into your content drawer. You should now have, under Mega Scans, 3D assets. You should have 2 folders: scattered granite rocks and small stone. Okay, so if you've got those, we're ready to proceed. So I mentioned when we were doing the grass that there were 3 ways of scattering things on the landscape. For that, we used the landscape grass type. For our small stones, I want to use a procedural volume, which will again scatter stones around a particular area. So the first thing I need to do to use procedural foliage is I need to switch it on. So go into the Edit menu, Editor Preferences, type procedural, start type it, and you'll see this procedural foliage checkbox. So make sure that's checked on before proceeding. And now we can create a volume to spawn our small rocks. So what I want to do is I want to have a volume that covers the whole of this riverbed plus the start of the slopes on either side. So I don't want it to go up as far as the snow line. So what I need to do is add a procedural foliage volume, and I can do that by adding all classes, and then I scroll down to P for procedural foliage volume, and you want this one, procedural foliage volume. Make sure you don't select the blocking volume, and just drag that roughly into the middle of the riverbed here. And now we want to scale it up. So you can do the same scale as me here. I've done 200 by 400, 200 by 400 on the X and Y, and then height I'll do 100, and then I'll just have a quick look around here. So you can see here that it covers quite a wide area here. It's probably too high. So in terms of area wise, I mean, you could cover the whole landscape if you wanted, so I'll leave that up to you. But height wise, I think I need to bring it down. So let's bring it down to 50. Where's that? Put it in the landscape. Yeah, that's probably about right. So it'll be on the slope, but not into the snow area. Anyway, we'll see when we spawn the stones how that looks. So that's our volume. Now what we need to do is we now need to have a procedural foliage spawner that can spawn the stones in this volume. So go to your content browser, go to the top level, right click, new foliage, procedural foliage spawner, and we'll call it PFS underscore rocks, and open that up. And actually let's put that in its own window so that we can play around with that. So move it across, and you'll see that we need to add the foliage types. In our case it's going to be rock types, and if we click on this and then click on here and type something like rock, there are no foliage types for rocks at the moment because we've got the rock meshes, but we haven't actually got rock foliage. It's an easy thing to create though, so leave that open. And what we'll do is we'll go back to our content drawer here, and next to PFS rocks we'll create a new foliage, static mesh foliage. So we'll just create one first of all, and then once we've got the first rock, I'm going to do 3 types of rocks scattered around. Once we've got the first one working, we'll duplicate it. So just call this rock 1. Actually, let's call it FT for foliage type rock 1. Open it up, and so we've got it open here on the right hand side. First thing we need to do is select the mesh that we want. So if you do rock here, we've got all our scattered rocks here. I want to do the scattered granite rock variant 5, variation 5. So you've got var 2, var 3, var 4, var 5. That's the one I want to pick here. And let's leave all of the other settings as they are for now. We'll change those in a minute. Just save that. Go back to your foliage spawner. So go back here to the content browser, open up the PFS rocks. Here, in fact, just move that along a bit, then we can probably see both. Yeah, okay. So there is our asset, the foliage type, and there is our PFS rocks. So now in our foliage type that we added, if we type rock, we've now got FT rock 1. Okay, that's all looking good. And we could try scattering those rocks now. So you've got the procedural foliage volume selected over here. If you go down a bit, let's see where I can find it. The first thing we need to say is which foliage spawner we're using in this volume. We've only got one, PFS rocks, so select that. And then if you go down, there's a resimulate button. Click on that and it should have generated some rocks. Now it may have done it. Yeah, they're very small. Let's go. If I go in here, you can see there's a rock, there's a rock, there's a rock, but they're spread out very thinly. The size is okay. They're a bit light as well, but we can change that later on. But we obviously want them a lot closer together. So let's, yeah, you can see them on the riverbed as well, scattered around. So let's start to play around with the parameters in our foliage type. So go back to this foliage type for the rock, and you'll see there's this section for procedural. So if we go to the collision section here, this collision radius and shade radius, it's designed for sort of foliage and trees where it's sort of growing apart from each other and not in the shade of each other. So let's move that much closer together. So the rocks can spawn within 5 of each other and within 5 of each other in the shade. Okay, let's try that. Re-simulate over here. And now we've got lovely little clumps of rocks near each other, and that's actually looking pretty good. So again, let's get a bit closer and have a look. Yeah, that's fine, and you might want to leave it like that, although I find with rocks sometimes it's useful to just sink them into the surface slightly. So let's go down to the, or let's go up rather to this Z offset. So basically at the moment it's spawning them at the 0 point on the landscape. So it's they're sitting on top of the landscape, which often is what you want. I mean, with foliage like grass, you do want that usually. So, but what if I sink it slightly? I'll actually put a Z offset between -2 and 0. So it's random. So some of them will be slightly sunk into the ground. And if I do save that, resimulate, now they're slightly sunk into the ground. Maybe it's slightly too much actually. They look more like they've been embedded. -1. Save, resimulate. Yeah, and they're just sort of slightly set in the path in the rock there. Let's do a quick run around and see what that looks like. So yeah, in terms of the number of stones, it looks good. The only thing is the granite is, to my eyes anyway, too light in comparison to the other textures. So once we've scattered the other 2 rock types, we'll go and change the material just like we did for the textures and the grass, and we'll reduce the value of the tint so it blends in a bit more. So I want to do the same thing for 2 other rock types. So what I will do is come out of play mode, and I will go to my content browser, and this FT rock 1, I'm going to do Control D to duplicate it, and again, oops, Control D to duplicate it, enter, then Control D to duplicate it again. So you should have FT rock 2 and FT rock 3. Open these both up. So I should have up here, let me just again move it along a bit more. So I've got my asset. There's FT rock 1 that I've done. FT rock 2, all I'm going to do is change the mesh. So at the moment it's var 5. I'm going to make it var 6. Save. And with the last rock, I'll change that from var 5 to var 7. So it's just a slightly different rock. Save that. And now if I resimulate, so with make sure you've got the procedural foliage volume selected, resimulate. Oh, and you see it hasn't changed here. That's because although I've created these rock types, I haven't added them to my spawner yet. So go to your PFS rocks, where I've got that one element here at the moment, and add, or just maybe you can just duplicate here. Let's have a look. Yep, just duplicate this twice more and choose FT Rock 2, FT Rock 3, save, and now resimulate on the procedural foliage volume. Okay, and you see now we've got bigger clusters of rocks and 3 different varieties of rocks. And although we didn't actually specifically say this, the default in the foliage type here is to have a random yaw here, so they have random rotation as they get spawned on landscape, so they don't all look as though they're in the same place. So that's looking pretty good. As I said, the last thing is to, and you see they go up the slope slightly, but they're not on the top of the hills. They're just on the starts of the slopes. So the last thing I want to do is just change the tint of the material. So again, it's a little bit menial, but we have to go through each mesh. So let's start off with FT Rock 1. There's the mesh, browse to it, var 5, open it up, browse to the material, open it up, and in the albedo tint here, select it and change the value. Let's change the value to 0.5 or maybe even 0.3. And you can see one of those 3 rock types has gone down in value. So let's click OK there, close that down, go to rock 2, open it up, double click, browse to the material, open it up. Oh, and in fact they're using the same material instance, so that's good. So I did think that the color had changed on all of them, so that's actually, you can see in the distance there's no ones that are highlighted. So actually we're done now with that. So you can shut that down, and in fact we will shut down this whole window here at the side and maximize this. And let's just check where we've got to now. So I go back to my sort of main viewpoint. We've got stones around. When I go into play mode, looks good. I can go down to the riverbed and there's lots of clusters of stones there. I'm still thinking I want to reduce the puddle size, but again, you can go to the auto landscape material and change that later. But yeah, it's looking good. So the other stone I want to add is in the riverbed I want bigger stones that would normally be at the sort of the side of the riverbed, and I want to make those so those can be climbed on as well. So I want to make sure there's collision on those. There's no collision on these small stones, but it doesn't matter because they're so close to the ground surface that you wouldn't notice as you're running through them, just like you don't notice with the foliage. So I'm going to use the third technique for putting foliage and rocks onto the landscape, which is to just paint them on manually. So to do that, I'm going to go into my foliage mode. Yeah. And in my foliage mode, I have to set up foliage types. You see we've got 3 already because we created foliage types for those 3 rocks. But I want to create a foliage type for my bigger rock. So let's go to our content browser, choose the small stone. Ironically, I'm going to use the small stone for the larger stones because it does work quite well. And all I need to do is take this small stone static mesh here and drag it in to the foliage section. Oh, it's done it. So for some reason I dragged it into the blank space, it didn't do, but if I dragged it on top of something else it did create it. So now I have a small stone mesh type here, so I can click on that And let's just drag up here so we can see some of the parameters. So in terms of density, I'm going to paint this on, but I literally want to paint individual stones. So let me make the density 1 here. And again, brush size probably doesn't matter too much because we're just going to paint them on one at a time. I've got 512 here. Again, paint density doesn't matter too much either. Let's look at the scale though, because I want, it's a small stone, but I want it to be a large stone here. So I'm going to make the scale between 20 and 50, so a lot larger than it was. And let's just paint one on and see what it looks like. Let's do it near here. There, you can see that it's not a small stone at all. So what I want to do is just dot a few of those around. So let me just come out again, right click, use WASD to move around. And what I'll do is I will just paint a few around the landscape, mostly on the river sort of side, the bank, rather than in the river, although I might put a couple there. Yeah, so just do a few more. Obviously I'd spend some time doing this, and I might just put a couple in the middle just for visual interest. Okay, so I've painted those in. They look pretty good. Again, might want to darken it slightly, although it's nice to have a bit of contrast as well. So let's come out of foliage mode. Let's do a quick save here, and once it's sorted out the pixelation and gone back to normal, I'll go into play mode. And what we'll notice here is that when we get to these stones, we are running through them. So there's no collision on them at the moment. So they look good. Again, I either need to lighten the riverbed or I need to darken the stones slightly in order to make them fit in. But the main problem I've got at the moment is there's no collision. So let's fix that problem. Come out of play mode. So what we need to do is we need to find that mesh. So if we go into our 3D asset small stone and just double click to open the mesh up, and let's put this on the main screen so we can see it. So here's our stone, here's our rock. We need to put some collision around it. At the moment, if I look at collision here, there is no option to remove collision because we don't have collision there at all. And there's various collisions you can add, but because we want to walk on this, if we had something like a simple collision, like a box or a capsule, it's just not going to look right because we're not going to be on the surface of the mesh. We're just going to be on a box or a sphere around it. So what we can actually do is we can add something. We can use auto-convex collision, and it will open this box here, which will allow us to create a more complicated collision. Now there is a cost associated with it, but we haven't got that many rocks on our landscape, so of these rocks, so it should be fine. So you can play around with the settings. So you've got the main one that affects how many vertices are created is this max hull vertices. So I've got 4, 16, and this hull position is defaults to 100,000. So click on apply and then have a look at it and see what it looks like. Oop, going a bit fast there. So that looks as though it might work. We might need a bit more precision, but let's apply that. I think I've applied it already. And let's see if that works. Let's go back to our game. And there's still no collision there. And that's because although we've generated the collision, we haven't specified in the foliage type to actually block characters with the collision. So come out of here, go into the foliage section and pick that small stone, and if you go down towards the bottom, there's a section on collision presets and it says no collision. So if we select that to block all, do a quick save, now go into play mode, and now it's working. And it's kind of working okay. So those settings I had were pretty good. So I don't look as though I'm floating on top of the rock. I look as though I'm standing it. And this character's got IK as well, so the upper leg is slightly raised, or the knees bent more. So yeah, it's looking good. So I might just change the material type. Let's just do two final changes here. I want to reduce the puddle size, and I want to blend in the rocks a bit more. So let's do the rocks first of all. So go to select mode, choose this mesh here, and actually you can see the material instance next to it. So let's open that material instance up here and just drag it out a bit so we can see Glacier Valley at the same time. Choose the albedo tint. Let's try halving the value here, and that's already looks as though it's blended in better, so I'm going to stay with that. Save that, close it down. Okay, so that's looking good. And then the last thing I want to do, in fact I'm going to do one final thing, but I just want to change these puddles first so we know how to do that. Go to our landscape, find our landscape material, browse to it, open it up, drag it out. Actually, let's close down this small stone mesh, don't need that anymore. And again, we want to go down to our puddle section. There it is. So it's section 3.5 of the material instance, and if I go to puddle size, let's try and change that to 50, or maybe even smaller than that. Contrast has an effect as well. Let's put the contrast to 7. Let's have a look around, see what it looks like. Yeah, so there's more dry. Let's do 8 for the contrast. Yeah, I quite like that. So there's just a few puddles around now. It's sort of slightly wet, but so I've chosen a puddle size of 50 and a puddle contrast of 8 to get that effect. And we're almost there. The only thing I want to do is, let's go back to my main camera view. In fact, I need to change that now I've changed the contrast. So let's go down and along a bit. Okay, I'll make that my new camera view with Control 1. And maybe I just want to put in a couple of granite rocks in the foreground just for composition. Again, if you're doing this as a game, that's fine, you're done. But if you're doing this for a composition or for a landscape, we've got our mid-range rocks here, we've got our path, we've got our riverbed. Might just want to put a sort of big granite rock here or here just for foreground interest. So what I will do is open my content drawer, go to the scattered granite rocks, and there was one here I quite liked. It was the variation 4, I think. That's version 2, 3, 4. Let's see what it looks like. Put it in. If you press this lock thing when you scale, it'll scale it on all axes. That's sort of what I was looking for. So that's, if I press E on the keyboard, it now has the rotation here. That looks pretty good. Let's if you press the end key, it will put it back in the put it back on the surface. Press W to go back to that mode, and you can just sink into the surface. It's pretty close to what I wanted. And then maybe I can just duplicate, so hold Alt and drag it away, and maybe I'll put another one down here. Again, press E and rotate around, so it's a slightly different angle. Press the end key to sink it into the ground, W to go back to this, and maybe just sink it down a bit more onto the path. And again, that's just some foreground interest. Again, it's up to you whether you add those or not. And we are pretty much done. So if I go into play mode, those stones almost act like a gateway into the path. I can go through here, down the path. I can walk on my rocks into the riverbed. I've got a muddy riverbed with the occasional puddle, and I can cross the riverbed and scale those mountains up there. And if I come out and go sort of higher, I should be able to see a whole sort of mountain range around me to explore. So the next step for you is to decide how you want to use your landscape, add whatever props you want, game elements if you're doing a game here. But I hope you found it useful. As I said, this is the first of a series of tutorials where I'm going to look at various landscape types and show you how to create them. And in each tutorial I'll be introducing a new feature for you to learn. So stay subscribed and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.